Almost every single day I log into PlayStation Network to play video games, and it isn't often that I think back to the time that I created the account that I use now. I created my current PlayStation account way back in 2011, right after an event so massive that it's still lauded as one of the biggest data breaches in history. And for me personally, it was almost like a repressed memory until the new Call of Duty game came out, and I was actually thinking back to the glory days of Call of Duty, because it's Call of Duty Modern Warfare. It's like kind of resetting the whole Call of Duty Modern Warfare universe or whatever, and I remembered that when I was getting really big into like multiplayer Call of Duty games around the time of Black Ops, which is the game that really, I guess, propelled me into multiplayer in Call of Duty games, PlayStation Network had this event where it just disappeared for a month, and I figured this would be interesting to talk about. Now, I had a PlayStation account before this, but unfortunately I forgot the password to it, and, well, you had to create a new password in order to sign back into these accounts after the services came back up. So essentially I lost access to my account, and, well, I decided that I was going to create a new one with a better username. Because, of course, when you're an 11-year-old kid like myself, you don't really pick the best name. Anyways, this event, this data breach, it was so significant that PlayStation Network went offline for 23 days. That's nearly an entire month, and it costed Sony $171 million in outage costs. Even today, very few data breaches have surpassed the scope of this data breach in damage to the servers, the scale that the impact actually hit it at, and the actual impact that it had on the users that were affected by the breach, and the impact on society as a whole, because honestly, at the time, this was one of the actual biggest data breaches that had ever happened. As of now, it's definitely being overtaken constantly by new, unfortunate data breaches all the time, so it's actually falling down on the list. As of right now, it is 12th on the list of the biggest data breaches of all time. But anyways, let's take a deeper look at it. If you've been around on PlayStation long enough to actually remember when it happened, you'll remember just how frustrating it actually was to deal with. I mean, there was no online functionality for an entire month, essentially, and for me, this was, like I said, right when I was getting into online gaming as a whole, not even just Call of Duty, if I'm being honest. So, I mean, I was just making friends online, so not being able to talk to these people for basically a month meant that I was missing out on a lot when it came down to it. This was also when I was, well, of course, getting into Call of Duty Black Ops, and I was playing a lot of this game, so for weeks, I mean, there was no playing the game online whatsoever. There was no games online at all. Now, I grew up playing like the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, things like that, so of course, I'm pretty used to offline gameplay. I know, some of you newer kids, you've become adapted to the online world. Everything is online now. See, when I was growing up, that wasn't the case, so I could deal with this a lot better than maybe kids today could have dealt with something like this happening. But in fact, it really all started with what honestly has over time become a pretty common Sony message. PlayStation Network is undergoing maintenance. This would be the final say from the network for a long time, and well, at the time, we thought in a couple hours we'd be back and playing video games again, having fun with our friends, bullying strangers in Call of Duty public lobbies, but in reality, Sony was about to face a nightmare so ugly, it would literally be marked into history books. But you can prevent yourself from being history. Dashlane is here to help you protect yourself and your data. Password generation and storage, VPN service, ID storage, dark web monitoring, and more. Dashlane makes sure to keep you safe on all fronts. Also, Dashlane uses military-grade encryption to protect your sensitive data, which is currently the strongest level of encryption available. You can also get Dashlane across multiple devices, so your phone, tablet, laptop, and your computer can all be protected. Don't be behind on your online security. Download Dashlane for free today by going to dashlane.com/Optimus and use code Optimus for 10% off of a premium subscription. Be safe online. Get Dashlane today. The truth was that Sony and the PlayStation Network service had become a target, and it wasn't because of the players and the video games on it, but actually really due to what Sony had done to, I guess, irk a very small subcategory of people using their service. According to an IGN article, the most credible source of all time, Sony basically kicked this whole thing off when they removed Linux support from the PlayStation 3 console, which led to some fans on the console to complain as, well, they still used this support and they found it very handy. They didn't want this gone, on, Sony got rid of it. They weren't really willing to talk it out with them, and, well, it created a rift between the community and Sony. Then comes a man named George Hotz, who was, at this time, a very successful and notable hacker. He successfully jailbreaks the PlayStation 3 console in January of 2011, which, of course, Sony, they don't appreciate this. And then, of course, well, he's not the only person who does something to irk Sony. A group called Fail Overflow in 2012 pretty much goes ahead and, well, trolls Sony too, by being so good at actually hacking the PS3 that they were able to discover private root keys from the console that would grant pirated PS3 software access to authorization on the console, essentially allowing people to pirate PlayStation 3 games. Of course, Sony did not take kindly to either of these things. I mean, they don't want their stuff getting hacked. Of course, lawsuits followed. Sony cracked down as hard as they possibly could, and while it drew the attention of famous hacking group Anonymous, who you probably have heard of, which launched Operation Sony, and they successfully launched DDoS attacks against Sony for a few days before letting off of them. But of course, all this stuff was not, the serious thing here. Yeah, Sony got trolled a little bit by some hackers and whatnot, and they got their stuff rooted through, and some pirated games might come out of it all. But then something serious happened. It went beyond some DDoS attacks and some root keys and some lawsuits. It went much further beyond all this. Between April 16th and 17th of 2011, hackers gained entry into PlayStation Network, and they stole the personal data and information of over 77 million users. They did this at the time undetected, and this personal data included things such as the full name of users, their addresses, the country that they lived in, their email addresses, their birth dates, their PlayStation Network passwords and logins, plus their online IDs, and it may have even included their user's credit card number and expiration dates without any of the security codes. More than enough information to create catastrophic damage to people's lives, especially if it went undetected. However, Sony finally noticed that they were breached on April 19th, and, well, they didn't actually shut down PlayStation Network until April 20th. On April 26th, Sony declared that within 1 week they wanted their network back online, but that's when they really finally came clean about the entire thing and actually announced that they were aware of something actually happening. So, essentially, for days, Sony kind of sat on the news, hired some outside investigators to come in and look at everything and try to figure out what's going on. Sony knew something extremely bad happened. They didn't know the scale of it, but they wanted to figure it out as quickly as possible. The window of the attack started just days before the public was aware of what actually happened, and Sony was aware of what happened in an incident where they weren't sure if their credit card information was stolen or not, but, well, knew for a fact that much of their other identifiable information was stolen. Yet Sony kept quiet about it for a decent amount of time before letting people know and potentially take any preventive action to protect themselves. They were obviously heavily criticized for these actions by the media, even by governments. To clarify, the data that had been included, well, it had names and addresses. This was apparently created in a database in 2001, and Sony did make efforts to remove the personal details of 2,500 people that was stolen by hackers and posted on a website, meaning that the information that was stolen was already being shared around. Sony had a lot to fix with their own players and public reputation very quickly. They had governments to answer to, the questions from them were mounting, considering what was going on. Players, they had to please them too. The servers had been down for weeks at this point. It's pushing into May now. People are obviously upset for very good reason because they don't know exactly what's going on. All they know is that hackers potentially have their credit card information, all of their personal information, and Sony just basically said, hey, we're sorry about that. We'll give you some free PSN games here soon, though. On May 6th, Sony announced publicly that their final stages of testing the new PlayStation Network were beginning, but unfortunately, the next day brought the announcement that they could not follow up with their May 1st's 1 week time frame because they did not know at the time the extent of the attack. At this point, they were essentially trying to rebuild the entire platform as quickly as they could, and realistically, this would come to fruition on May 14th, when services would come back online slowly as firmware 3.61 came out, which did force all users on PlayStation Network to change their password in order to even sign into their accounts. Now, if you're like me, you change it to something that you can't remember for some reason, and then you lose access to the account, and you have to create a new account. So, don't be that person, don't be like me. Now at this time, the network was still actually offline altogether. This was just a firmware update for security. That way when they actually brought the network back online, they actually had gotten this out in time for the security changes that they had made to actually have taken effect on people. But various services such as the sign-in for PSN, the online play for the PS3 and the PSP, third-party services like Netflix and Hulu, and the chat functionalities, they actually started to come back online slowly but surely. Now, unfortunately, this was not the end of problems for Sony. On May 18th, another major security flaw was discovered in the whole process, causing Sony to shut down the password reset page on the website, which of course was a major part of restoring their whole network in the first place. Now, this part was due to a flaw in the system that allowed other users who were completely unrelated to reset another's password randomly by knowing their email address to log in with and their birth date. By having these two pieces of information, they'd have the only two things necessary to reset the password for the account, and so, with it, they could theoretically steal another player's account. Signing in using your PSN login was disabled to some Sony websites, but not on consoles. Within just a few weeks, Sony had two major security issues on their hands, and this of course looked like a major oversight on their part. Tens of millions of accounts involved and their reputation completely on the line for this, and, well, when it came down to it, Sony was fined just $395,000 by the British Information Commissioner's Office for the entire thing. Now the good news is, as of now, it isn't believed that credit cards were involved in fraudulent transactions as reported by the major credit card companies. Of course, that's good news, which I guess would indicate that credit card numbers and information like that wasn't actually stolen during the breach. But of course, you know, nothing can really be ruled out. Finally, at some point though, they actually got PlayStation Network back up and running, and thankfully by mid-May of 2011, PlayStation Network was finally back online for pretty much everybody. Sony actually gave everybody 30 days of PS Plus for free for this whole thing, along with 2 free games to select from, depending on where you live, I think. Like, if you lived in North America, I think the games that you could pick were different than if you lived in, say, Europe or in, like, Japan or something like that. And I can remember actually getting to pick those 2 free games. And then 2 weeks later, after, you know, resetting my password to get back onto the account, getting my 2 free games, and just being happy to finally be able to play online again after a month of not having the game online, I realized that I forgot my password, and the 2 free games were gone along with my account. Just a little trip down memory lane, because I think that it's interesting to kind of reflect on, because I feel like it's a really unique situation to look back on, because like there's so many data breaches like when you look back on the last couple decades, but PlayStation Network as a gaming service is one of the biggest of all time, and it's kind of just crazy to think about. Anyways, thank you guys for watching this video. If you did enjoy, make sure to leave a like, subscribe if you're brand new around here on my channel, follow me over on Twitter at @SupToOptimus. I post memes, thoughts, and updates over there. It's a surefire way to get notifications of all my newest content. Join the Discord down below, lots of great things going on down there as well. Thank you to my channel members, your support helps my channel tremendously, and until my next video guys, this is Optimus, probably having to wait on the PSN servers to go down for maintenance again, because they still go down all the time, and signing out.